Welcome to the Intelligence Spotlight series. Today we are starting with a wonderful person. Meet Jenna Dolecek. She's part-time investigator, part-time human rights defender, and full-time believer in the power of open source intelligence. With over 10 years in the field, Jenna's work sits right where the digital world collides with real-world justice, actually. And she's armed with an LLM in international human rights and humanitarian law from the University of Essex. She's not just tracing tweets or mapping satellite imagery. She's using OSINT to expose war crimes, document abuses, and support accountability in some of the most complex conflict zones of our time. You might have seen her work with Myanmar Witness and or Eyes on Russia, or OSINT for Ukraine, for instance. Projects where she didn't just watch history unfold, but helped capture it in real time with digital evidence. She's also a rostered expert with Justice Rapid Response, where she brings geospatial and investigative tools into fight for justice. But beyond the data, Jenna's also a teacher at heart, building capacity, training new investigators, and pushing for ethical, sharp, and resilient OSINT practices wherever she goes, actually. And it's quite inspiring. And Jenna is one of those rare voices who brings both sharp analysis and real empathy to digital investigations. And we're very, very thrilled to have her on the show. Jenna, welcome.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for joining. So before we jump into the world of open source intelligence and investigations, tell us, if OSINT investigators had spirits of animals, what would yours be and why?
I don't think I've ever had a question like that before. I would say probably any creature that's really, really curious and that likes exploring. We tend to kind of obsess over finding answers to questions and always wanting to know more, wanting to go further. So I think curiosity is really at the heart of what we do.
Right, right. Absolutely. I think if you ask me the same question, sometimes I just call myself like, okay, I have the spirit of an elephant, being protective of my tribe, like in the field that I am, and also not bothering anyone else if unless needed to. So Jenna, you've worked in some of the most complex and politically sensitive ocean environments, from Myanmar to Ukraine. It's like a quite stretch from Southeast Asia all the way to Eastern Europe. Uh, when you're diving into a new investigation, what's your first instinct? Where do you start exactly?
Yeah, I typically work recently with organizations, and so I try to get caught up kind of on all the background or all the work they've already done to build from that and make sure I don't duplicate anything. But I really do try to get a sense of whatever it is, the topic or theme that I'm working on, just to make sure I've got a good understanding. If there are any outstanding questions, maybe that I need cleared up, and then just going over any documents or reports organizations or a partner may already have. So it's really good to get that solid understanding first, just to
Mhm.
make sure there's no redundant work or missed opportunities, missed questions, or even maybe cultural considerations that could be overlooked or mistaken in kind of a way.
Mhm. Yeah, interestingly, that's one of the ways and very important ways to start into an investigation. So your work also bridges OSINT in international law, and it's also partly because of your background, I assume. Maybe can you walk us through how open source evidence actually gets used in legal accountability, say at the ICC or in human rights reports?
Yeah, so it's depending on who's using it, whether, it's the ICC, whether it's UN mechanisms, Amnesty International, those are all very different organizations and they use those
All
things
right.
in different ways, whether it's for advocacy or sharing with courts. So depending on how it's used, there can definitely be differences. So at the ICC, they have their own investigations units, but they also
Mm-hmm.
do take in information from external partners such as UN mechanisms and civil society as well. So it could possibly be used as, I guess, what I refer to as direct evidence or indirect evidence. So
Mm.
a video could contain the act being committed and showing the perpetrators and showing the victims. So I would more refer to that as direct evidence. And then yeah, maybe we have social media photos and videos by witnesses that may give context to what happened or could potentially show parts of events or crimes committed. So those can also be included as sort of contextual and supporting information or evidence. So and evidentiary standards also come into play as well if you're sharing with the ICC or UN mechanisms. Uh, Whereas with like Amnesty or other CSOs or something like that, the thresholds are a little different. And it's used slightly differently, not necessarily as hard evidence, but maybe sort of evidence for the public, essentially.
Right.
But there are differences there, and they do matter when you actually are submitting it as part of a case. So with UN mechanisms, open source information is maybe added to case files and legal
Mm-hmm.
briefs that are prepared to share with courts. Um, or again, CSOs may gather their own and share it with UN mechanisms who then share it with courts. So it
Yeah.
kind of is shared both directly and indirectly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think OSINT generally wasn't very popular within the UN mechanisms a few years ago. So, but I mean, the challenge in most places where there is conflict, or especially if it's ruled by groups or rulers that actually suppress information, it's very hard to verify, and it's very hard to collect evidence of human rights abuses. Say, for instance, in Afghanistan, recently, for the past few years, I mean, since the Taliban's takeover, I've seen that the United Nations mission in Afghanistan are including open source references to some of their documentations of crimes that are committed. They also like cite Afghan Witness from this Center for Information Resilience that in their work have been very crucial, for instance, for in terms of human rights documentation and verification. So absolutely, it's critical, and also there's a sensitive part about the ethics of it too. And you've been outspoken about ethical OSINT. And in real terms, what does that look like when you're dealing with things like graphic content, for instance, potential witnesses, or just be disinformation around an incident?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces of the sort of ethical puzzle, if you want to call it.
Yeah.
There's obviously concerns for staff, for collectors, for investigators, concerns for people who either have come across the content and have sent it to us, or that took it directly and maybe
Hmm.
sent it to us. And then, of course, ethical considerations for those who were shown in the photos or videos. So this is something I encountered fairly early on in my open source career. Thankfully, they touched on ethics very early. This is back in probably 2016 when I got my first training on it at the University of Essex through Amnesty International's Digital Verification Core. So we talked about yeah, privacy concerns, how to protect people that we find in content, and then this carried over to a project I worked on with Tom Jarvis, who's also at the Center for Information Resilience,
Right. Yeah.
called Tibet Research Project. And that was kind of one of our first more real world hands on experiences with how do we protect people, especially when we're, you know, taking on a topic that is very hostile to some governments
Yeah.
or parties or things like that. So, you know, we always start out with never, ever, ever, ever publish any sort of identifying information about witnesses or victims, even if it's at the expense of your investigation or something like that. But I think we're all at a point, especially in investigation, where it is understood that that's what you do. That's not going to
Hmm.
impact your credibility or anything like that. The only thing is um, potentially a sharing partner like a mechanism or the court might ask for that original source,
Hmm.
but it's done in a very secure and confidential manner that still will not put that potential provider at risk.
Hmm.
So, secure methods of communication are essential, secure methods of information transmission, encryption, all those things are steps you need to take to keep people safe. At
Hmm.
Center for Information Resilience, at Myanmar Witness, our methodology when we would enter things into our database, we had a particular section for privacy concerns. So
Hmm.
if you could see any victims or witnesses faces, if it was filmed maybe from their home, or there was any sort of other identifying information in the video, we would
Right.
not reference it publicly. We would mark it as a
Hmm.
privacy concern. And if it was used in a report, we would say it private source with privacy concerns. So we would never
Hmm.
publish that. But then we might have to share it again with a mechanism or a court, because they obviously need the original source.
Hmm.
Um, and I think for protecting analysts and investigators, I won't say too much on this because this might bleed into another question, but we do try to take an approach that you don't need to see everything. You don't
Hmm.
need to watch
Right.
things that you really don't need to. If it's not your investigation, you don't really necessarily need to see it, to hear it. Not because uh, it just may not be pertinent to what you're
Right.
doing. And so we do worry about overexposure, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. I also take an approach to just don't do anything you don't need to do, to kind of protect yourself as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I also dealt with a lot of those contents in the beginning, and it was difficult to manage because at the end of the day, when you're working on an investigation, sometimes the human mind, once it's focused, it gets too deep looking at the details that normal people wouldn't look at, especially if you're carrying forensics of,
Hmm.
okay, the entry wound, where is the entry wound, where is the exit? What type of explosive? Was it a bullet? What was it, right? So that overall exposes you to a lot of graphic details, but then I learned another approach to carry on. For instance, I did a lot on Afghanistan, and there was a lot of executions in the first and the second years of the Taliban's takeover. Like they would execute prisoners, and a lot of killings and revenge killings that were happening. But most of them, interestingly, were also recorded. So they were talking. So of course you have a very distorted video, bullets and shouting, and then you hear things, but every detail matters in that situation. And I wouldn't watch the whole video. I would just keep listening what they're saying, and then through that I would just say, okay, the victim said that, and then okay, they were killed, and then the perpetrator said that, and that was used as a translation, for example. Or if that was about an execution, I wouldn't try to associate about their identity as a background. Oh, that's a human being. I It is in a way, but you also have to protect yourself, and I think it requires also some time to build that resilience of considering it purely in a cold-hearted manner that doesn't affect you. But of course, you never will be a cold-hearted person. But that's the thing. But in its responsibility, and it's a defensive mechanism to do that. And but now, I mean, since the last year, things are changing in the OSINT world as well. And a lot of traditional OSINTers are, some are finding it difficult to deal with AI, for instance, and some are happy about it because okay, the argument is that for some it makes their work easier, but for some saying, okay, no, but there are details that AI could never be able to distinguish the context that it has and so on. So I'm also in between both personally, because I see the pros, but I also see the cons. And there's also this rush for the automation of OSINT through AI tools. But you also came from a background that value human analysis more. And so what do you think we're gaining or losing in this AI heavy OSINT wave?
This is very timely and relevant. This question has come up a lot this past week, actually. So
Absolutely,
I'm
yeah.
I'm kind of with you. I'm like caught in between. Um, I I see an amazing opportunity for application, in so many ways. I mean, it is amazing what it can do. But I do think we need to be very careful about the consequences and downsides of using it, not just in open source, but also in general. Um, so there's so many ways it can help me in my work, mostly just in saving time, which is usually, one of our most precious resource kind of in this field is everything is so time consuming. But at the
Right.
same time, that's also what it takes to be thorough, which is what you want in an investigation. Of course, you want to, right, turn over every stone, look under every leaf, things like that. Make sure you didn't miss anything. Make sure you got all the details, things like that. But I think it can really be useful in automating some of the smaller tasks that do take up a lot of our time, that are necessary, but that do keep us from potentially focusing on other things as much. Or maybe you have to divide work up across the team, which is still good and usually necessary anyway.
Mhm.
But maybe somebody gets stuck more with collection, maybe someone gets stuck more with something else. Like I would love it for it to clean my spreadsheets, clean data.
Yeah.
Everybody usually has a task within their job that is absolutely not their favorite, and they wish something else could do it. So that's a
Absolutely.
really big one, and collection's a really big one that's really, really time consuming. Even if you have tools that do, screen captures and get the metadata and
Mhm.
download files and things like that, you still have to sit there while it's doing it. Then you have to organize your files, maybe upload it to your eDiscovery database or your database, things like that. So
Right.
the time saving factor is massive, and of course I hear people talking about using it for geolocation, which again, extremely time consuming, especially if you're in a really rural area without a lot of frequent satellite imagery, photos, videos, things like that. You really get stuck
Yeah.
um, just due to lack of information. So some of these tools are solving that problem, which is great.
Yeah.
But I do have concerns over the security, what we're
Yeah.
putting in to these systems. We don't know who has access to it. We don't know how it's being used. That is a very big concern for me.
Mhm.
Of course, the environmental cost is a concern as well. Um, and then at the same time, we've caught it hallucinating, we've caught it lying, making up fake legal cases and citations. So
Mhm.
even though it's made to save us time, it's also costing us time because then we have to go
Yeah.
through and review every single footnote that,
Yeah.
someone produced when we found out it's AI. So
Yeah.
I think we're putting a lot of trust into something that is definitely not yet perfected. It is improving. And I mean, when it does make a leap, it's in development, it's generally a huge leap.
Yeah.
So it is getting better, but I think we do have to be very careful with how much we're trusting it, which
Mhm.
also goes for any tool that we use, especially if it's a third party tool or just kind of made
Yeah.
by a user on GitHub that we don't know. We kind of want to assume the best in people, of course, but
Mhm.
we do still need to vet our tools just to make sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of really good applications for it that could really help. But we do just need to be careful, and we need to be having these conversations, which I'm not seeing as much. I
Mhm.
think it's getting there. We're finally talking about, the potential downsides and consequences. But I think that really needs to be at the forefront of the
Right.
debate first and foremost, and to again keep people safe. But yeah, I do think there's a lot of potential with it for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I guess what the generative AI does is mostly the notion of confidence that it projects when it writes something, right? And even if you try to track it, it will come up with an analysis that is so convincing. But
Hmm.
then, if you're expert in your field, you know this is all bluff in a way.
Yeah.
I actually tried it with two different images. One was AI and one was like real. I put the real one and I said, "Oh, I'm not sure about this picture. Is it real or AI generated?" It said, "Oh, you're right about this. This might be AI generated because," and it came up with its standard analysis categories. Oh, because the image is too soft, or the image, the clouds are not correct, or it looks like that. But the image was real, but it was a high quality image. So it thought maybe, okay, because it's high quality, it's AI generated. While for an AI generated, it said, oh, the person looks real. It has a proper wrinkles around the eyes. But of course, AI can't generate those sort of details, and it gets way much better, like with the VO3 of Google that generates videos with dialogue and proper characters and has a lot of cultural understanding, especially because Google has access to the massive data that it has, and it's dangerous in a way for, I mean, disinformation. But I think that's another case, another discussion for it. But yeah, it has pros and cons, but we have to discuss it more. And that's why, I mean, your work is you're not just doing the investigation, but you've trained others in OSINT as well. Um, what are the biggest misconceptions, I mean, you have seen among the beginners, for example, and what do you wish more people understood before jumping into that space?
Yeah, I've definitely encountered this. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that it is kind of a technical magical wand.
Yeah.
It can find anything, it can do anything. And is as amazing as open source can be, just like anything else, it is not, the final thing, the end all be all, essentially. It definitely has limitations for sure. It should be used with closed sources as well, with victim and witness testimony and just other contextual knowledge, information. So I think that's a really big one. I've had that with colleagues who maybe were new to open source, just other people I worked on with a team that, right, didn't quite understand. And we got requests that, yeah, we had to explain, I can't create something out of thin air. Essentially, if it doesn't exist, I can't find it for you. But
Yeah.
I appreciate, people's confidence and trust in us. And as much as of a wizard you can be, again, it doesn't do everything. So I do caution people with that there are limitations, as amazing as it is. Um, and a lot of times I've seen analysts get frustrated not being able to find something. But I think you also have to keep in mind what you're working on. So if you
Yes.
are working in a very rural area that doesn't have a lot of maybe communications, internet connection, smartphone use, photos and videos, you're potentially not going to be able to find, a 75-year-old farmer that doesn't have a
Right.
smartphone. They're not going to have
Absolutely.
a
Yeah.
Facebook. I tell people just because we put so much on the internet does not mean everything is there.
Mhm.
So I do see frustration when they can't find things or can't find things fast. So it is a balance between, am I using the right tools? Am I looking in the right place? Am I asking the right questions versus given the context, does it just
Mhm.
not exist? Or
Yeah.
is there some other reason why I can't access it? Is it censorship? Is it, something like that? Has it been removed? you know so those are I think difficult for beginner analysts, is to, I learned all these things and it's amazing, why can't I find it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Seasoned analysts, we run into walls all the time for various reasons, and it could be things we could get around, could be things we couldn't get around. So
Yeah.
it really depends. um I think the other thing right now is also terminology. OSINT is
Mhm.
the big common word for sure. But not everybody works in intelligence. Not everybody produces intelligence. And so,
Yeah.
especially when you're working in the legal realm, words matter. Using the correct words matter. So, on investigations, I never refer to what I do as intelligence, because it's
Mhm.
not. I'm using open source tools, open sources to find open source information
Yeah.
within an open source investigation. So there's kind of umbrellas. Open source information is used in investigation, but vice versa, things like that. So I do try to caution people against terminology and not say that they're doing something that they're not, essentially.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of definitions going around about what
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
is. I use
Yeah.
a very broad definition and terms, and that's just open source is just another source, essentially.
Yeah.
And really, open source has been around forever. It's not, just within the last 10, 20 years, or just since the internet was made. Anything you can get your hands on that isn't closed victim testimony
Yeah.
or military and government intelligence is open source. So I mean, it's essentially almost everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Definitely.
so that's usually what I teach people. I give it a broad definition rather than a narrow one. But I am seeing, especially within the last 5 to 10 years, people are defining it as the internet or even just social
Mhm.
media. But I mean, geospatial satellite imagery from Google Earth, that's open source.
Yeah.
Alien geoports, anything you can get your hands on essentially is.
Yeah.
Um, so I think those are kind of the biggest things I tend to teach newcomers is be patient. It's not always you. Sometimes the information just isn't there, and that's okay. And then also, you don't know everything. Admit what you don't know. That's really big for credibility, especially when you're working on a legal case.
Yeah.
Is you don't want to stretch or embellish or lie about what you know or what you found. I mean, that instantly
Yeah.
impacts your credibility, the case's credibility, and the organization's credibility. So that's really, really big, is
Yeah.
always admit what you don't know. And that's a good thing rather than a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, information integrity, I think is really, really huge.
Yeah, you touched upon a very important aspect, like having patience, because I see a very uh, like a big difference between open source investigators and, let's say, investigative journalists using open source versus people who are just starting in OSINT and they think they're a journalist, so they have to convey as fast as they can the finding this that they do, because I don't know, for some reason they may have, okay, I want to get more engagement on social media. I want to say I was the first who verified it. But also there is this fine line between a reporter and someone who's doing investigations, and especially in conflict monitoring, right? As let's say on social media, things go viral before they're even verified. And for that, how do you approach this sort of tension between being fast and being right?
Yes, time is again a very, very precious resource, but I have seen issues with it for sure. Uh so in my case, working on contracts, sometimes I do have hard deadlines to get some of these investigations done, and it's almost always never enough time.
Yeah.
But it's so extremely hard to predict how long an investigation is going to take because I don't know what's there until I go looking, and even then I can look here and here and here and here. And so eh, everybody always asks me, when do you know to stop? That's always a
Yeah.
common question is when do you know to stop? And the answer is it depends. It's That's a little bit separate from, yeah, just kind of the time in general. But I think because of how fast things go online, how fast things disappear, that also influences how fast we work. I think maybe a bit
Mm,
subconsciously. We're worried about things disappearing. We're worried about missing things, things changing, not collecting it fast enough, not analyzing it fast enough, not reporting on it fast enough. So I do push back against the urgency a little bit where I
mhm.
can, especially if it doesn't involve a legal case where there are submissions that have to be made
Yeah.
in a timely manner. If you're outside of that, I really just want to tell everybody to slow down.
Yeah.
Is within reason, of course. Like I said, there are things that are time independent. There are things that do need to be um told to the public,
Yeah.
that they deserve to know about. So it's very much a balance, and it's a difficult balance. You have to juggle, competing priorities and tasks all the time, especially if you're working a large investigation or multiple investigations. Maybe leadership wants to get it out, at this time, for great biggest impact or because it's the hot topic right now, so you want to keep
Yeah.
attention on it. So all those things I do think just have to be very carefully balanced, but it's hard to get it right. I mean, we've all had that urgency. We've all wanted to make a great impression with our sharing partners or the organizations we're working with. But I think overall we all need to take a bit of a breath, just in general, and I'm absolutely fall prey to it as well. Especially analysts, we get very obsessive. And then if maybe you're a perfectionist on top of that, that those are deadly
Yeah.
combinations that we have to balance. Um, but I
Yeah.
think we do need to be a little better about taking our time, especially because with certain biases, we want to jump to certain conclusions. We have to be very, very careful about that. I'm on the team where I do not think all bias can be removed. That's just not possible. Our experiences are our bias, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we just
Yeah.
have to utilize that properly. But there are other biases that absolutely we do need to be aware of and try to remove as much as possible. So I think one of the biggest that I see is and there may be a proper term for this, so I apologize if I don't know it. But kind of being on the side of the good guys. You want to assume that if something comes out that they did that was wrong, you don't want to believe it because they're the good guys. Why would they do that? So there is sometimes a lot of pushback against also investigating and exposing wrongdoing by the good guys essentially, or just always assuming, oh no, that's not them, or that's disinformation by the other side to discredit them. So I think,
Yeah.
you know, that has to be balanced carefully as
Mm,
well. But yes, there is just kind of a sense of urgency in general. There's so much going on. There's so much information, people should know. But we need to be careful and, like you said, not sacrifice the integrity of the information
mm, mm,
or the quality essentially,
mhm,
just to make sure, right, so people get views or something doesn't disappear, or we get it out there. Like, things are going to be missed, things are going to disappear, and that is something that we just have to accept. We cannot collect everything all the time, and we
mhm.
don't need to as well.
So, you gotta be quick and try to verify that before it spreads even faster. Uh, And the problem with algorithm is that once something gets trending, you have to counter it at that moment because that keyword is trending. So when you write and use the similar keywords, you get those views and your content is also pushed towards it. But if you do it, let's say 24 hours later, in terms of like a video fact checking, of course, the next day that video is irrelevant. Whether that was true or not, nobody even talks about it anymore. That's how it works. Unfortunately, that's how algorithm is, and I blame it for it. But uh, you got to play around sometimes. Um, Now, I think it's best to talk about tools because I think that's the most favorite thing about being an OSINT investigator. Um, so, what's one OSINT technique or resource you think is underrated at the moment, but has helped you again and again in your investigations?
Yeah, and this one might be a little boring for people, but I do see a lot of cases where reverse image search is ignored. That step is
Yeah.
ignored. Um, that has caught several cases of misidentification, false identification. I had an investigation that I was working on, and I had a few pictures of an individual, and I did use them to try and find reverse image search to try and find other content. And the pictures that I had kept bringing up this other individual. And this also kind of speaks to where maybe some of us, and this is something else that I've seen, we try to do things that we're not fully trained on. We can do it to an extent, but I'm not a forensic,
Mm, mm,
traditional forensic analyst. I haven't done a lot of yeah, kind of facial build, facial recognition, kind of that stuff. When we're trying to ID people, I think we have to be very careful as open source analysts without any forensic analysis of, yes, this person's this person,
mm,
make sure, it's not just that they're, have brown hair and blue eyes or whatever. You need to look at a lot of other things, face shape, placement of things, but we're
mhm,
not experts in that. So I did have a situation where I, saw this other individual. I kind of started following that rabbit hole. And at some point I did come across other photos for the original individual, reverse search those, and after seeing those photos as well, I was like, oh, this is definitely not this other person that I found. And thankfully I caught that, because
mm,
that's not
mm.
always the case. But also thankfully that one um wasn't, trying to think of if I'm getting this mixed up with another investigation. Anyway, luckily I caught that in time, but it just reminded me that yes, a lot of times we are trying to do things that we aren't necessarily
Mm,
trained for, even if we do have hands-on experience doing. So we just need to be really careful.
yeah.
If you do have a network of colleagues you can reach out to that do have that experience, you always need that second opinion, or make sure to put in your report, like, I think these individuals are the same based on these reasons. However, a second opinion is definitely needed by somebody with more of that specialty knowledge. So, reverse image search can save you days, weeks, months of work,
Mm,
um,
mm.
just with
Absolutely. Yeah.
a 30-second search. It can also save you from misidentifying potential perpetrators, which is huge. And so I think that's a very, yeah, basic, underrated tool, honestly, to use.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, and it's widely used and it's very easy to use as well. It's
Yeah.
not that difficult. You just put a picture, upload a picture. That's it. Let the machine search engine find it for you, and just and there are also some advanced techniques around it in case if you can't find it through that. But I think these are what you've discussed so far. It requires a lot of digestion because the information that you provided, the techniques you have mentioned, all comes down to curiosity, right? And all comes down to your mind that how you see, how you connect. Even if you miss something, it's your curiosity. Oh, something is not right about this. Let me go check it again. So that's, I think, it also requires this mindset. I had another episode with a fact checker from the Reuters. He said it's not just about like giving opinions or knowing this and that in terms of investigations or verification, but also it all comes down to mindset. So you have to build that mindset for it. But let's look ahead in the future, and this is also a hypothetical question for you. If you had the funding and the freedom to build any investigative project tomorrow, no restriction at all, what would it be and why?
Yeah. So there is something I've kind of always wanted to work on, but I found a little difficult ways in for multiple reasons. So as much as I usually have an international focus, and I love really I'll work on anywhere around the world. I don't necessarily have a preference. I have worked on investigations all around the world.
Yeah.
Um, but there is a situation across North America, which is an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people, and across the
Mm,
U.S., Canada, even into Mexico, and I'm sure down into South America as well. But from the North American perspective, in the last several years, kind of task forces have just now started to be created. Because frankly, nobody cared about this
yeah.
situation, unfortunately, except for the people that were affected in their communities. And so I'm glad this is now getting attention because it's deserved to have attention for decades. This has been a problem for decades.
Mm,
So I do think there's an opportunity for open source to assist in investigations, either to find missing people, which is already being done by like trace labs or doing kind of capture the flags and other sort of um, gaming investigations, essentially.
yeah.
I guess I don't want to call it gamifying investigations, but collaborative and things like that. So
Yeah.
I would really love to see that applied to this epidemic in North America, that's particularly impacting Indigenous people who have historically, obviously been marginalized. So I'm glad it's getting attention, but I do see a really big opportunity here for application to potentially assist with these investigations. So I'd really love to
Mm,
get involved with that, whether even if it's just capacity building and teaching the Indigenous communities to use these skills on their own. If
yeah.
they don't want, if they want to more kind of own this investigation, which is they should, it's their communities,
Yeah.
or right, having outside assistance, which does exist to an extent. But I'd love to equip either college students or young people with these skills because it's not only applicable here, it's applicable everywhere. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I'd probably say in a perfect world, I'd really love to assist with that situation.
That's a very considerate of you and very, I think, not many people actually touch upon that. I think this might be a quirky statement, but I actually got to know more about the Native Americans and their suffering even now in the 21st century in the Yellowstone TV series. It actually touches upon these missing people that are taken away and killed somewhere and like their bodies thrown out in like a ditch in a
Mhm.
desert, mainly in places like Wyoming and Montana, those places. So I think it's a very niche one, and I hope that this could happen. And anyone listening, if you're a funder, if you're someone who is interested in that, go to Jenna. She's there. She's leading it, and with the whole context behind her. Thank you so much for your time. It was very informative, and I hope we stay in touch. And then one last thing, if you want to share like an advice, like a note, and something that we missed discussing, feel free to.
Yeah, I think we did forget to touch on secondary trauma a little bit, which I think
Right.
is hugely important for newcomers and for seasoned individuals. It's being talked about. Thankfully, it's gaining a lot of traction in the field. I first heard the term vicarious trauma back in 2013,
Mm,
and then I've since gotten training, 2016 and then on. But I think some organizations are still falling a little short. And I took it upon myself at a previous organization to design and give secondary trauma training because we weren't getting enough support from the organization. And so I had a colleague who specialized in that. She gave her blessing, and I started giving it to all new staff, interns, and others because I just see time and time again people jumping into this field and not having that training, and I became a little militant in it to where if we had new
mm.
staff or interns or volunteers, I would not let anybody work
Yeah.
until they took that training because I said I don't want to traumatize people right off the bat here. That's extremely irresponsible, and I'm not having it. So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
tend to put my foot down when it comes to that. Um, but yeah, I would say because we have a tendency to be so curious and so obsessive,
Yeah.
I refer to it as morbid curiosity.
Yeah.
It's the train wreck you can't look away from, those kinds of things. And we have to be careful with that and control that. And I've absolutely fallen victim to my own curiosity when I wished didn't have, wouldn't
Yeah.
have. And so I would say, I there's a whole lot of tips and tricks you can do to protect yourself while viewing material. You can do things beforehand, during, and after that help. But I would also say, don't look at anything you don't need to see. I
Hmm.
understand the curiosity is there, but
Yeah.
especially those of us in the field, we know what's going on. We know what's
Yeah.
happening. We know the horrible things that are occurring. We don't need to watch all of it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I limit myself from looking at content of certain conflicts because of how it affects me. But I know what's happening. I don't need to watch it to know.
Yeah.
That's different for the public who may not know what's going on. But there's obviously, I think, a debate with showing that material to the public without any sort of content warning or training.
Yeah.
Essentially, we're all just essentially traumatizing ourselves. Um, because we don't know about these things. So I would say, get secondary trauma training if you haven't had it. I'm happy to provide secondary trauma training, or give resources or
Hmm.
something, but I think it's really huge. And a big thing I think is, don't deny it.
Right.
Everybody is affected, and if you say you aren't, either you're not human
Yeah.
or frankly you just don't want to accept it. So it does affect everybody, but if it affects everybody differently. It can be, short term, long term, intense, not intense,
Hmm.
and everybody experiences a variety of different I guess symptoms, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
So yeah, secondary trauma is very big to me. It should be important to everybody. I
Yeah.
push back on the, toughen up or get out mentality. I don't
Yeah.
think that's realistic, frankly, because, I think our brains aren't necessarily geared towards seeing this
Yeah.
24/7, you know.
Yeah.
So I think those people are doing themselves a disservice. Those people are affected, whether they want to believe it or not.
Yeah.
But I don't think, pushing that on your team is is a good idea. It's frankly irresponsible. I think you need to
Yeah.
support your colleagues better and have more flexibility and understanding. And I always tried to sort of get a sense of my team. And, I had a colleague who, they couldn't deal with injuries
Mm.
or images of dead bodies or things like that. And I was like, no problem. Those don't really bother me as much. My mother's an ER doctor. I'm used to those things. So I'm like, that's not a problem for me. That I can deal with. So if there's anything you can't, feel free to hand it over to me. I can take that. Or a colleague who they couldn't work on detention because they
Yeah.
had a brother who had been detained and mistreated, and that's completely understandable. That's very triggering. So I think trying to, share the burden as best you can across the team
Mm,
without
mm,
overly burdening anybody. But I think we also commonly forget about translators and interpreters. That was
absolutely, yeah.
something that hadn't even crossed my mind until the last several years, where they have to listen and hear everything, read everything. They don't get to turn it off like we do, especially if we don't speak the language. Then I don't
Mm,
need to hear what's going on in the video because that's not relevant to me.
yeah,
So I get to have that disconnect. I'm lucky and privileged that I can have that disconnect because I don't have that language.
yeah,
Um, However, when I was working on US, that wasn't the case. I did listen, I did read.
yeah.
So I think don't forget about your translating and interpreting colleagues because they do, I
Mm,
think, and typically because they speak the language, they're likely from that country, and so they have even less of a disconnect, if any disconnect at all, than those of us from other countries that might be working on
mm-hmm,
a different country. We can have a bit more of a healthy disconnect, and this is also what I try to tell people in my training is that you do need to have a bit of a healthy wall. That doesn't mean
mm,
complete emotional disconnect. That doesn't mean complete numbness, apathy, but you do need to have a bit of a wall. And that doesn't mean you don't care. That doesn't mean you're not empathetic, but we
yeah,
do have to protect ourselves as best as we can. And that goes for the people that are from the affected countries
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
We all need to have somewhat of a protective bubble as best we can to keep doing our work and to also just keep going on in life as well.
yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the last I'll add there.
Yeah, that's a crucial note for everyone. I mean, yeah, it's not about being cold or anything. It's just about if you're protected, so you can carry that work even further. Otherwise, okay, if you're fallen for it and if you're hurt, then I mean, the real work is left behind. So nobody would bring justice to those cases, for instance. Thank you so much, Jenna. It was very, very informative talking to you. I hope the audience enjoys the conversation, and if they have any questions, they can, of course, direct it to you. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.